Yes, guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to tonight's live stream. And the Chelsea takeover saga that seems to have been rumbling on for an eternity is finally nearing completion. Todd Boehly's consortium is imminently going to be given the green light by the Premier League. And I'm delighted to be joined by journalist Ben Jacobs, who's been across this since the beginning, and his coverage has been absolutely superb on it, been pretty much spot on with everything. And we're going to just chat about things in a bit more detail. Ben, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it, mate. First things first, then, obviously, this has been rumbling on for a while now. It is going to be Todd Boehly. But I just wanted to start with the reports that came out last night, or reports, scaremongering, whatever people want to refer to it as, that, you know, there was alarm within Whitehall that potentially the sale may fall through. Now, just to clarify, from what you're aware of, that is obviously totally untrue, right?
Well, I wouldn't call it scaremongering. That's the first thing to say. And takeovers are complicated with a variety of perspectives. And I would certainly take issue with any criticism to brilliant journalists, colleagues of mine, and reputable outlets that are also doing their best to delve into the takeover. There's no denying that a DCMS perspective relayed to certain media outlet painted a picture of alarm. So that's not a manufactured word. That is a briefing to various outlets giving a perspective, which means when you hear that perspective, the challenge is whether you take that as legitimate or political. Is it accurate or is it gamesmanship, for want of a better word? And in determining whether that's a reality and a Chelsea takeover might fall through, or whether it's a means of controlling the process and the speed and putting pressure on Chelsea and Roman Abramovich, you obviously have to speak to other people. And as other outlets, including myself, have done, we realize there are perspectives. And Chelsea and Roman Abramovich have taken the exact opposite perspective to the DCMS and said very clearly that they don't believe there's any alarm and the process is on track. And I've also learned in the last 24 hours that Chelsea do not see Camberley as any part of this takeover. And as a consequence, where the funds will go, either in a frozen capacity or eventually to the new foundation, are not of concern. What is of concern, but not necessarily alarm, is how quickly that foundation can be formalized, because that ultimately is where the sale funds will go. So that's the intricacy of the process. And what you find within that is, despite a briefing or an official DCMS perspective intentionally put out there to, I think, pressurize Chelsea and Abramovich into speeding up the process and getting this takeover over the line, you then get other ministers and people close to the takeover within government giving a different perspective. And naturally, as a journalist, what you do when you see a word like alarm is you talk to as many people as you can. And my understanding, to be clear, having spoken to government ministers close to the deal, even if the government want that word alarm out there, is that the process is largely on track. And by largely on track, I mean it will be done before May the 31st. And in terms of the stumbling blocks that are delaying things, and there's definitely been a delay, it is about where is the sale money going to go and what are the specifics of the foundation, and fundamentally, can the government ensure that no funds go to Abramovich directly or indirectly now or at a future date, as long as the sanctions remain. And this is complicated and being done at speed. So then you have to start thinking, well, how are we defining alarm? Because the whole process is alarming. It's been done at pressure. It's been done with drama. It's been done with multiple suitors. It's been done on global time zones. So how you gauge what constitutes alarm is a whole separate debate. But the bottom line here is whether or not there are concerns. They're not necessarily brand new concerns. The handling of the loan money, for example, has been discussed for weeks. And in addition, the government are going to have questions and points of negotiation, because they only got the paperwork for the sale around about a week ago after the purchase agreement was signed. So you have three scenarios between now and May the 31st to complete the takeover. Number one, Premier League owners and directors test. And that's a formality, and it is indeed imminent, and it may well even be completed this evening, but certainly by the middle part of the week. And there's never been a doubt over this particular consortium, Clearlake Boehly, passing that. Then you have the government approval, and they have to go through everything. They have consultations with Chelsea and Abramovich's people, and they may even have some clarifications based upon what Clearlake Boehly have presented within their business plans. But really, the government approval is about Chelsea and Abramovich's people and the government themselves. And Clearlake Boehly are sort of stuck in the middle of that, and they kind of have to wait and allow those parties to come up with a solution and a sign-off before they can do the third aspect, which is the transfer of funds. And again, that's a formality, but it does take a day or two to transfer that type of money into the appropriate account. And once all of that is done, a takeover can finally be completed. So when you ask for the current state of play and is it scaremongering, I would say if it is, it's not necessarily the journalists inventing anything. Quite the opposite. They've, to their credit, found a line that has been given to them formally on behalf of the DCMS. There's other people within government that deny that and perhaps give a more leveled approach about the reality of the situation. But they've not just plucked that word out of nowhere. They've not tried to get a will the takeover fail angle. They have had a briefing with an official source, and that particular individual has told them that either because the individual believes it to be the reality or because they want that out there in the media to put pressure on Chelsea and Abramovich. But as I said right at the beginning, the reality of the situation is that Chelsea and Abramovich strongly deny that there's any alarm. And as far as I am aware, the most important point, the takeover does still remain on track to be completed by May the 31st or before.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. It's obviously a very complex situation. I suppose like takeovers, particularly of this size, aren't used to being rushed through in this amount of time. As you see with Newcastle, another example of a takeover, that's 18 months. This is like kind of unprecedented, I suppose, within takeovers of football clubs. Chelsea are going to become the most expensive sports club ever, when this goes through. So we're talking about large amounts of money, a lot of things that need to be crossed off. So whilst I guess it's frustrating as a fan, these things do take time. I just wanted to come back to a couple of things you raised, Ben. The first one in regards to the proceeds of the sale and the, charitable foundation, that money may or may not be going to. Now, obviously, that's kind of a bit of a sticking point at the moment. I've seen that Mike Penrose, as a former chief executive of UNICEF UK, he's been recruited to establish the foundation that would be charged with using the $2.5 billion of proceeds from the sale of Chelsea to benefit the victims of the war in Ukraine. Now, obviously, that's great that it's going to go to a charitable cause and Roman wants it to go there. Fantastic. But how much of a hold-up is this proving? And is that something you expect to be sorted out quite quickly?
Well, I think there's always been a race between the sale and the transfer of funds and the formal foundation actually being functional, but they don't necessarily need to wait to approve a sale until the foundation is actually running, because the funds can be held in an account. So as long as the government are satisfied that the foundation will be formed and they have legal guarantees of where the money will go, and that's the big argument from the government, is they're saying, Abramovich is saying publicly the money will go to a charitable cause, but then he's not, they argue but Chelsea refute, putting any legal guarantees behind that. So what if, in theory, the money went into a holding account and then the foundation fell through? Then what would happen? But I think the government's main concern in signing off the sale is that they've got control of the funds and belief after that they'll go to the right place. So it's actually the planning of the foundation, even if it doesn't launch by May the 31st, that's of most importance, because the funds could just be held in an account up until the point that the foundation actually is functional. And as a consequence, you don't need the foundation to meet the same deadline as the sale, which is necessary for Chelsea because their special license expires on May the 31st. But the other factor with the foundation and why it's important is that it can't be political, it can't have Abramovich influence, and the government are in a difficult position because ideally you would want it to be fully functional because then you know the entire structure. So a scoping document has been submitted, and the government therefore can see how it will be structured and why it won't have any influence from both Abramovich and, as importantly, and often an underrated point, Chelsea as well. They can't benefit from it. So this is an entirely independent foundation that is ideally structured in a way that will not only allow the sale proceeds and in all likelihood loan proceeds to be spent on the victims of the war in Ukraine, but also have a legacy beyond that. So if, as we all hope and pray, the war stops and then everything returns to normal in a year, 5 years, 10 years, you still want that foundation to have a legacy that is gaining donations and doing good in that particular sector. And to start that with this level of money is difficult and backwards. Again, everything in this process has either been rushed or atypical. And it's exactly the same with the foundation. Imagine if you start a charity from scratch and I say to you, before you know exactly where the money is going, before you've got a board, before you've got employees, before you've got an office, before you've got a license, before you've got any kind of plan, I'm going to give you an insane amount of money. What are you going to spend it on and how? And what operating costs do you have? What's the business plan? Where are you going to be based and registered? What happens if the war ends tomorrow? Then what are you going to spend the money on? What is a victim in the war in Ukraine in terms of the who part? And by that, I mean, is the money going to go during a live war? So therefore invested into Ukraine's infrastructure. It could be around repair of damaged buildings. It could be around medical aid. It could be around food and supplies. Is it going to go around refugees outside of Ukraine to help them resettle? Is it going to be invested into more of a program for after the war to help those affected by it get back up on their feet? Is it going to go directly to the victims? Is it going to go indirectly to the victims? Is the capital going to be spent in a liquid form and given directly to people? Or is it going to be invested into things that could generate repeated income and benefit Ukraine and its people? And again, these are all conversations that have had to happen very quickly, and the government are fully entitled to ask exactly what the plan is. So the money's come before the plan, and that's the problem with the foundation. But fundamentally, the foundation, as long as it's not influenced and as long as there's no benefit to Abramovich or Chelsea, should satisfy the government enough. And then any kind of UN influence or any trusted charitable partners that are part of it will add that stability and that layer of protection that Abramovich can't come back in and either influence it or somehow take the money. And then it can be put to one side. And I think that in the next few days, the government and Chelsea will get there on the foundation specifically. And then as long as they're happy with the foundation, which is the end part of where the funds go, they then need to just put the funds into a holding account. And as long as that holding account isn't Fordstam to Camberley, there again should be a complete separation between Abramovich and Chelsea and the funds. And at that point, a sale should be completed. So the simple answer is that the foundation doesn't have to, although it would be preferable, be ready to go on May the 31st. But the government have to be satisfied with the foundation plans, and only then will they allow the funds to go into a holding account until they are eligible to be transferred into the foundation once either it's up and running or a plan for the money is up and running. And the reason why I separate those two aspects is because if a plan for the money is up and running, from a legal point of view, the money can be transferred to the ownership of the foundation. They don't then have to be ready to necessarily spend or distribute it. Again, ideally they will be, but there are steps to this. And step one can be a Chelsea sale as long as the government are satisfied, and then Chelsea will get a new license under Clearlake Boehly. And then steps 2 and 3 regarding where the funds are held, when they're transferred to the foundation, and how they are spent are all extra steps in the process that are essential, but can actually be completed after the sale and the new license is given to Clearlake Boehly, providing again, and it isn't if, the government are satisfied with the plan. And these are conversations that have been happening for a week or two and will continue over the next week or two, heading towards May the 31st.
Yeah, in regards to deadlines, I know there's a fascinating insight there. Something as a fan that you don't really understand the complexities and the intricacies that actually have to go on with every single little thing that needs to be done. So yeah, it's very interesting to hear how much has got to go into each step of the process. In regards to deadlines, Ben, obviously you mentioned, something could be done potentially as soon as the middle of this week. Obviously, we've got the May 31st deadline, which is when Chelsea's license would expire. For one reason or another, in a worst case scenario, were there to be any hold-ups or something to happen and the May 31st deadline weren't to be met, I understand that there's another deadline on the 8th of June. Would the licenses obviously be extended? Would there be any differences to the current license that is in place were that situation to occur?
Well, first of all, there's 3 deadlines. 2 of them are on the same day. So you've got May the 31st, Chelsea's special license expires, but May the 31st is also the European deadline for registration, which goes via the FA. And that is not an immovable deadline either. So there is a hypothetical where if Chelsea's special license was extended to allow the club to function, they could miss the European deadline and thus not be eligible for European competition next season. And then you have the 3rd deadline, which is June the 8th, which is very similar to that European deadline, but it's the Premier League deadline. So when the Premier League meet for their AGM on June the 8th, they must ensure that all of the clubs are correctly registered for the forthcoming season. And they cannot register Chelsea for the Premier League season if they don't have a license. So that's in the backdrop. And some of those deadlines sound quite scary. But there are loopholes and certain aspects of those deadlines are fluid and flexible. So if we take them one by one, Chelsea's special license, which is obviously the most important one. I'm not saying it wouldn't be a disaster if Chelsea couldn't participate in European competition, but you'd rather take that than the club going totally under. So the special license is obviously the most important one. Now, the government are in control of that. So if their alarm, as they have said in a briefing, is down to the fact that they're running out of time, the time is perversely in the government's control. And at this point, they've made it very clear that Chelsea are on borrowed time and they won't extend the license. But if it genuinely became a choice between extending the license or allowing Chelsea to go out of business, they would, as I understand it anyway, extend the license. They're just not going to publicly say that or even potentially tell Chelsea explicitly at this point, because they want to keep the pressure on and the sale on track. Because from the government's point of view, it's a fire sale. And one of the frustrations during the process is that Chelsea have tried to do this on their own terms and based on a structure implemented by Rain Group that has sort of mimicked tender, which we associate more with broadcast rights. And I think the government feel that Chelsea have made it very structured, very formal, very controlled. I know some fans listening might think that Rain Group delayed all the time, but trust me, for a sale of this speed, it's been a sanguine, calm process, given the amount of suitors. And I think the government feel like there almost should be more urgency, which sounds like a bizarre thing to say when it needs to be done so fast and everyone knows it. But I still think the government think that this should have been wrapped up earlier and that extending the special license until May the 31st was more than enough time. And now it's a race against time and the government aren't happy about that. But if it really came to it, it's in the government's power to do anything. They could remove Chelsea's special license today if they really wanted to, but they could extend it indefinitely. They can also tighten the conditions or they can loosen the conditions. So if there was a potential scenario where a few more days were needed, it's very likely that the government would extend the license if that was their only choice, but they might well tighten the conditions. They certainly wouldn't extend the license and allow Chelsea freedom to do what they would consider frivolous things that are non-essential. So they wouldn't be able to sign players. They wouldn't be able to sell things like season tickets or take any kind of commercial liberties or do any launches or excessive travel pre-season abroad if it wasn't already pre-planned. But luckily for Chelsea, a lot of their off-season plans have already been in force before the sanctions came in, which is why the club have felt for a long while that they can function comfortably until the end of the season and beyond, as long as, of course, they've got that license. So officially, it's a hard deadline of May the 31st, but a lot of people within Whitehall are saying, and I think even Todd Boehly believed this, that if push came to shove, the license would be extended if the only other option was that Chelsea would go out of business. So then we come on to the other May the 31st deadline, which is the FA registering their teams for European competition. And there's two schools of thought here. One is that Chelsea could have their special license extended if the takeover wasn't done by May the 31st, but they wouldn't be able to enter into European competition. And the other is that they would simply be registered under the existing special license into European competition. And then when the new ownership group came in, the license would be able to be switched. And although in theory that's possible, because any football club could be taken over on the deadline or shortly after the deadline, and then under their new ownership group, they would need a new license. But of course, the complication here is how UEFA would react to that, because they may reject Chelsea's license, even if it is functional by Premier League terms, arguing that under UEFA terms, all Russian clubs are banned from European competition, and Chelsea under Abramovich have got Russian links. So could UEFA make a connection using Abramovich and say that actually Chelsea cannot enter the Champions League due to their Russian links? But in legal terms, Chelsea could counter that and say, well, you allowed us to continue in the Champions League in the previous season when the sanctions were in force. So there's precedent for Chelsea Football Club when you kicked out other European teams to continue in the last Champions League, and therefore the license should be good enough to enter into the forthcoming Champions League for 2022-2023. So that will be down to lawyers and clubs to navigate, but those are the options with the Champions League deadline. Either Chelsea would have their special license extended to get the takeover past the line, but they would miss the 31st of May deadline to enter into the Champions League, which wouldn't be ideal, but as I say, better than going out of business. Or Chelsea would extend their special license because that's their only option, and then they would enter the Champions League on that existing license and switch it over after the takeover is complete. And even I think Takeover Boehly at this point don't know what the exact answer is to that question specifically about the Champions League license on the 31st of May. And then the Premier League license, it's just a very similar story, that if Chelsea had their special license extended and then the 8th of June came and there were still new owners not in place, would the Premier League simply register Chelsea under their existing license and switch it across? Probably. Or would the Premier League say that Chelsea do not have new owners and they don't want an Abramovich-owned club still in terms of the legalities of the license in their league? The Premier League, being very cooperative, are highly unlikely to take that route, but it is an option at their discretion. But the June the 8th deadline is not as concerning, because if it got past May the 31st, Chelsea are in trouble without a license anyway. And then the 8th of June deadline is immaterial, because if they're licenseless over those 8 days before June the 8th, Chelsea are in big, big trouble of effectively going either bust or out of existence, because they don't have the ability to function as a business. And as a consequence, the situation regarding either the May the 31st existing special license or a sale and a new license will have been resolved before June the 8th. And as a consequence, June the 8th is a looming deadline, but it can't get to May the 31st and then nothing, and then 8 days pass, and then no one knows where they stand. And then the Premier League have to decide whether to register Chelsea without a license. It won't get to that point. So the Premier League will know where they stand by June the 8th, and then they'll have a decision to be made. So really, it's the first two May the 31st deadlines regarding the existing special license and the entry into European competition via the FA that are the two most important ones. And then if, as I say, the special license just got extended because the takeover hadn't happened, then when we get to June the 8th, I can't foresee a scenario where the Premier League would do anything other than register Chelsea for the forthcoming season under their existing license. And I know that sounds complicated, and I know it's probably quite a rambly way of trying to delve into each of those aspects. So I hope those listening have been able to kind of digest the intricacies of that. But the short answer and the bottom line is that each deadline is very complicated.
Yeah.
And once again, both Chelsea, Abramovich's people, and Takeover Boehly are still confident that none of these permutations will come into force, and they will have a sale by May the 31st. But the caveat once again to that is that it is true. There are parts, at least, of Whitehall that don't believe the timescale is realistic. Hence why yesterday they flagged that there was an element of alarm to the process.
Yeah, well, as long as Chelsea aren't playing in the National League next season, that's the most important thing. Moving forward then, Ben, obviously this Boehly Clearlake bid will obviously go through. What can we expect from this consortium? Obviously, kind of Todd Boehly seems to be kind of the main guy behind it. Obviously, Clearlake, as a private equity investment firm, will have 66% stake, I believe, in the club. But obviously, Todd Boehly will be in charge, will have controlling power, being kind of charge of the day-to-day stuff. Very briefly then, because a lot of people I've chatted to, seen on Twitter and stuff, a little bit concerned about, not being owned by, say, a consortium rather than an individual person. There's a lot of, Romans kind of really a lot of Chelsea fans have known. So kind of the fear of going into the unknown, having a consortium. What role will Clearlake be playing when this goes through? Obviously, you said 66% majority share. Are they going to have board members? How's that going to work? What's their sort of position going to be once this goes through?
So Clearlake was always the plan from the start. And one of the reasons why Todd Boehly partnered with Hans-Jörg Weiss first and then brought Clearlake in was because he didn't see value, and nor did Weiss, in majority ownership. So Clearlake took some by surprise, but it was always the consortium's plan from the very start. And during the slight delays over shortlisting the final bidders through to final offers, nothing changed in terms of the makeup of the Clearlake Boehly consortium. More just came out in public over those weeks. And as a consequence, I think certain fans panicked because they're not as comfortable going from Abramovich to a majority owner that's a private equity firm. So Clearlake will actually have a 60% stake in Chelsea. It was 66 originally, but it's been reduced since due to extra investment that the consortium agreed to put into their final offer, which, if you include everything, totals 4.25 billion. And the extra money that they put into Chelsea has been fronted by some of the minority investors. And that's why Clearlake have, as I understand it anyway, got 6% less. But the actual numbers make no real difference. Chelsea fans, I don't think, need to panic, because the whole point about Clearlake and the consortium is it's a sustainable business model. It's not based on massive debt financing. It's about building Chelsea as a club and a brand. It's about integrating further the academy with the first team. It's also about continuing to develop the women's side. And the fact that Todd Boehly is the face of it, and he's already shown, I think, in photographs and in his investment time-wise, going to games, engaging with fan groups, being at the FA Cup final, and other board members going to the FA Women's final too, that he's going to be personable and transparent. And I know Chelsea fans will like Abramovich because he won trophies and spent a lot of money, but let's not forget that Abramovich was faceless. He wasn't transparent. And I'm not saying that all football owners have to be, but given his alleged links with Putin and the sanctions against him, and even before the war in Ukraine, the fact that he couldn't set foot in England and Stamford Bridge, there was actually a disconnect between Abramovich and the fans. And the only connection that linked Abramovich and fans was through the football team and winning. And some fans may be comfortable with that. But if it was my club, I would want to know exactly who my owner was and what he was doing and where his money came from and what his plans were. Because when Abramovich first entered Chelsea, the business model was very different to now, because the landscape's changed and new competitors have followed Abramovich's heavy spending model. So it's not as guaranteed that you can just buy your way to success. And Clearlake Boehly differ because they're more sustainable, and also because their goal is not only to succeed on the football field, which of course fans want first and foremost, but it's also to ensure that the club modernizes. And that's why the redevelopment of Stamford Bridge is so important. But also, Boehly and Clearlake are about creating a people culture and a fit at Chelsea. And that means thinking about the recruitment model on the playing side and making sure that it's not as cutthroat as under Abramovich. So again, there'll be Chelsea fans listening that say, well, yeah, Abramovich was cutthroat, but it worked. But what you have when you're cutthroat is often a short-term spike followed by a schizophrenic culture or identity. And that can sometimes be masked by success. But behind the scenes, if every time you bring in a different manager with a different style and a different budget and a different philosophy and different backroom staff, that change behind the scenes leads to a lot of loose parts. And eventually that ends up meaning that you've brought players in that don't feature, or they were a good fit under one manager and they're a bad fit under the next manager. So when I think about all the interims that have had success at Chelsea, even the unpopular ones like a Benitez or a popular one like Di Matteo, each change leads to something. But then after it, what's the legacy of that constant cutthroat philosophy at every level of the football club? You've got a trophy, but what you don't always have is a sustainable legacy. And the new managers that come in have to constantly adapt and change because they've got too many players in their dressing room, or they've got a new philosophy and not everyone is the right ego or fit. And Chelsea have had that habit of constantly overbuying, overspending, and not developing their talent, whether they're ready for the first team or not. And I think the new ownership group will look to have a more staggered approach that guarantees success, but also pathways. So those that make it to the first team are the right fit. And if you look at Liverpool, they've got that right cultural fit. And whoever they sign will work under Klopp, but also potentially after Klopp. But the ones that fail will have ways to fall back into careers in football, and Chelsea can commercialise the failures as well as the successes, much like Liverpool do really well now. And that will be, I think, their approach. So it's about redefining the recruitment model. And of course, from Clearlake's perspective, if they can commercialise those that don't work at Chelsea, they're making money from that. And if they've got the right fits at Chelsea and players have got a bit more longevity, then in addition, you have to sign a lot less players, because it's not as much trial and error in the market. And in doing so, you're saving money in terms of your incomings and you're making money from your outgoings. And that's where the investment aspect and Clearlake will, I think, come in. But I don't think it's cause for concern, because Clearlake, first of all, have committed to staying at the football club until 2032. So they're not in it for the short haul. They're not looking for an immediate return. And the other aspect of Clearlake is that Behrad Eghbali, who is one of the co-founders, has been heavily invested in the pitch to buy Chelsea and is a big football fan. And he'll take a place on the board. And then my understanding is that Clearlake may have a second board spot, which is yet to be determined and may not be until the Clearlake Boehly group come through the door. But they'll probably have two spots on the board. Behrad Eghbali will be one of them. He'll have a big say in all of the financial decisions. And then Boehly will lead on the day-to-day and the transition, along with Marina and Buck. And Jonathan Goldstein, even though he won't be on the board, will be absolutely integral, because he's the one with the football knowledge and also the redevelopment knowledge, and is very much going to be Boehly's right-hand man. And between Boehly and probably more on a day-to-day Goldstein, that will be the heart of the running of the football club. And then Mark Walter and Weiss will be more sort of, not necessarily silent investors, but they certainly won't be as involved on a day-to-day basis. And I think that when you combine all those aspects, you've got a very safe, sustainable, and exciting consortium, because Clearlake will know how to get investors and globalize the brand. Boehly will know how to do the day-to-day and operational side. Goldstein will know how to get the redevelopment off the ground. Existing Chelsea executives will know how to maintain everything that Abramovich was able to build. And then Weiss has obviously got capital that he can bring into the mix too. And I think that there's no egos in this consortium. And there's a lot of other people I haven't mentioned, by the way, as well, like Danny Finkelstein, who are going to be really important on the government relations side, on the communications side. And each of them, my sense anyway, are transparent and personable and football fans. And that's why I am very impressed. I must say as well, during the bidding process, I was equally impressed by the Sir Martin Broughton bid too. And huge credit to them for putting themselves out there and coming very close themselves to being the preferred bidder. But this consortium have delegated different aspects of what's needed at Chelsea, whether it's the business side, the football side for the men and women's team, the academy, the growing of the brand, the sustainability, because Abramovich's business model was not sustainable despite the success, or modernizing aspects of the football club. And each area has an expert, either through the listed consortium or via consultants that will be involved once they assume control. So on the redevelopment side, David Hickey, Abramovich's project manager for his attempted redevelopment, has been involved in this consortium. And that's why I think Chelsea are in safe hands, because you've got no ego, not that I've encountered anyway, albeit I can't speak for everybody and I only get the perspective of a journalist, but I've certainly found, and I think Chelsea fans have seen already, Boehly and those connected to him to be open, transparent, willing to engage with media and fans, and they've brought in experts that know what they're doing. And I think when you combine all of that, my own personal take is that Chelsea are in very safe hands.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot to be positive about there with, the way they go about things. I mean, from my own perspective, I think Todd Boehly comes across very well. He's very, hands-on with the fans, wants to get involved. He's got experience as part of the LA Dodgers, very fan-driven, wants success, is prepared to invest in the playing squad, etc. Wants to keep Chelsea winning, which is all great. I suppose the one worry I guess you can always have is that it's all very well saying these things, but once you're through the door, you don't necessarily know what the reality is going to be. Obviously, there's no red flags to suggest that Boehly is not going to be a good owner for the club. But kind of a couple of people you touched on, Ben, Bruce Buck and Marina Granovskaya, obviously both been long-term associates with Roman Abramovich. Understand that in the transition period, at least in the short term, they will both still be there. Obviously, Boehly's consortium and I think some of the other bids as well were favouring to bring in a director of football, someone like Paul Mitchell from Monaco potentially. I know Michael Edwards at Liverpool is obviously outgoing as well. I don't know how likely he would be. In the immediate short term, this summer certainly, Marina and Bruce Buck are safe, are they? They're going to remain in their roles?
That's the official line, and all you can do as a journalist is report that. But you have to understand the context, which is there's gamesmanship to the bidding process, of which we're effectively still in. So if you know that Buck and Marina are involved in the decision-making process, it's entirely counterproductive to tell them during that bidding process that they're going to be out of a job when you walk through the door. Then you walk through the door and you've got the control. And at that point, their futures will be resolved both in the short and the long term. So the weakness of the Broughton bid was that they had a ready-made chair lined up to come in. And if you're Buck and you know that that group have got a chair, he may not be able to say so because the bidding process is quite rigid, that it counts against them. But it's obvious that if you want to come in at Chelsea and you know that someone like Buck is influential and Marina too, if they want to stay and you tell them they can't in the bidding process, then you probably will lose points, whether officially or unofficially, and it shapes the process. And I do think that counted against the Broughton bid, especially because there were fine margins between the Broughton group and Clearlake Boehly. If we take them one by one, they're different situations. So Marina hasn't decided her future due to close ties with Abramovich. But Clearlake Boehly, as I understand it, find her very engaging, excellent at her job, and would very much like to keep her in the long term. But nothing has been discussed and won't be until they're through the door. And that is very much a two-way process. And I don't believe that anything has been decided by either Clearlake Boehly or Marina in terms of short or long-term future, other than a desire on all parties to have a smooth transition period. And as a consequence, it's highly likely that she would stay through, at worst, a transitional period. But I think Clearlake Boehly would be quite happy to keep her on in the long run, although I'm giving you my opinion there, and sources constantly reiterate on that particular point and her that nothing has been decided. With Buck, it's a little bit different because his position is he would like to stay at Chelsea Football Club, and that has been made abundantly clear. Hence why it worked against the Broughton group that they had another chair in place. And the official line given off record, if you like, to most media is that Clearlake Boehly will be keeping Buck on as chair, at least through a transitional period, and the transitional period hasn't been specified. So we don't know whether that's a few weeks, a few months, a year, a season, or indefinitely. And I think that's logical because even Clearlake Boehly can't really understand what the transitional period will be until they're officially in charge, because it's such a complicated ownership structure and football club to take on. Now, the only thing I would add to that is that I would not at all be surprised if in the long run, at a point, and again, I want to separate this very clearly so I don't generate a story without context, at a point in the future, undefined and separate to the current state of play, which is that Buck will stay on through a transitional period, if not beyond that. And again, he and Clearlake Boehly need to discuss this. But if we separate that for a moment, it would not remotely surprise me if after however long Buck stays at the football club, whether short-term or long-term, the next chair of Chelsea after him is Todd Boehly. And I think that's the politics of it all, that whenever Buck goes, even if he stays for a decade, the next chair for me after Buck is Todd Boehly. And I think that he wants it at some point, and that is naturally creating an element of complication. So I think in all likelihood, Boehly will put that aside for now and is probably not even thinking about it or planning it. So again, I want to be very clear here. I'm not suggesting Boehly is going to come through the door and suddenly get rid of Buck and take his seat as chair of Chelsea. I don't think it's that immediate. But my point is that after Buck, and at some point, because he's in his 70s, Chelsea are going to have to think about that. I think the most logical next chair for Chelsea is Todd Boehly. And that creates a really interesting plot to the whole Buck situation. Because at what point will Boehly think, once a transitional period has happened, he's better positioned to lead on, as chair, the strategy that he's presented to take Chelsea Football Club forwards? And this is all speculation at this point because we don't know the answer. But I do strongly sense at some point after Buck, the most likely candidate to be Chelsea chair is actually Todd Boehly himself. But coming back to your question, the difference between Buck and Marina is that Buck wants to stay, Marina doesn't know. Both will be there for a transitional period. And then beyond that, Clearlake Boehly have to focus on getting the sale complete. And only once they're in the door will they then start talking further and in more detail with both Buck and Marina. And with Marina, it's much more of a two-way process because I don't think she's decided if she wants to stay. And I think that Clearlake Boehly would like to keep her. But with Buck, I think it's clearer cut because he wants to stay. And therefore, Clearlake Boehly have to determine how long he stays for, if not indefinitely. And then should he leave at any point, whether in the short term or long term, how they're then going to replace him. So I don't think it's always helpful to group Marina and Buck together because they're not a double act or a package. One wants to stay, Buck, and the other hasn't yet decided. She might be open to staying, but she genuinely hasn't decided. And that's why I think it's worth, as I've done, separating their situations to try and explain the context behind the decisions that may see them stay in the short or long term, and why one who's older and is a bit more staunch and intent on being part of the new Chelsea is going to have to be dealt with differently to Marina, who Chelsea might have to court a little bit more because she hasn't yet made it clear that she wants to stay at the football club in the long term. She's also not made it clear that she doesn't want to stay. She's just stated very clearly that no decision has been made yet.
And obviously, yeah, I think it makes sense. Tuchel is obviously himself quite happy with the structure above him. It's a big transition we're going through with a new ownership. From my perspective, I think it would make sense definitely in the short term to keep that hierarchy the same above him. But I just wanted very briefly, last thing, round out on a lot of things in the chat saying about investment this summer, Boehly's plans. Obviously, it's well known that a lot of Chelsea players are moving on. The model's going to have to change in regards to transfers. We're potentially looking at a more data-driven process, a more statistical way of signing players, being smarter in the market, not just chucking big money at big names and hoping it works like Chelsea have done in the past and haven't had a great deal of success with their signings. How much investment can we expect from Boehly, and what sort of approach can we expect in the transfer market, maybe this summer and potentially going forwards, just to round out?
Well, I think you said the word transition, and briefly, that's the key word, because clearly Boehly are not going to come in when Boehly only met Tuchel and Hayes a few days ago and redefine everything overnight. They will want to work with existing Chelsea plans and probably transfer budgets as well. Luckily, the club are well within the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules and financial fair play, so that's not as big a factor. But I can see Chelsea spending healthily in the market, at least 100, 150 million, which, as I understand it, was the scheduled or budgeted amount under Abramovich, assuming that sanctions didn't prevent it. And then, of course, on top, you've got opportunism in the market and any income that Chelsea generate through sold players. I don't believe at this stage that the Boehly Group have put some fixed or sky-high number on it, good or bad, that is different to the plan under Abramovich, simply due to the speed of the sale. And the reason for that, to try and understand, is because they've only been able to come in and do due diligence and understand every aspect of how the club functions and outgoings for the men and the women's team and what's available and things like where Chelsea stand on profit and sustainability once they got through to the final shortlist. And as a consequence, they can't just find a ton of money and glibly allocate it towards small, medium, or big spending. So there will be a commitment towards strengthening Chelsea. And that commitment, I understand it is born more out of the fact that big players are leaving. Unfortunately, Alonso looks like he's out the door. Christensen, Rudiger. And it's exactly the same on the women's side as well, where 3 or 4 players have had contracts come to an end or have chosen to leave the football club. Chelsea women are going to have to look, for example, to replace G. And they themselves are fighting on exactly the same fronts as the Chelsea men's team, looking for success in the league, domestic trophies, and the Champions League as well. So there's almost a necessity to spend because of the outgoings, and there will be some income generated by 1 or 2 of them as well. But I don't think the group are just determining to come in if those outgoings weren't so severe and just make a statement. The first thing you do is talk to your managers, Emma Hayes and Thomas Tuchel, and work out where they want to strengthen and what the existing transfer plans were. And sometimes fans get a bit ahead of themselves in a window and they don't realize that all good clubs are working 2 or 3 windows ahead. So there's 2 aspects to a window, so people understand. One is opportunism, and that is either based on someone suddenly becoming available and you realize you've got the funds to buy it. And I think Clearlake Boehly will be perfectly willing to dig a little deeper into their pockets if that eventuality materializes. Robert Lewandowski is a good example. I don't see him joining Chelsea, but he's a player that Chelsea have tracked. And when they got Lukaku and Lewandowski was on their radar, they thought that Lukaku was a more realistic target. And now Lewandowski is available again in the market. Barcelona is a more likely destination. But if there is opportunism there to dig a little deeper and get a Lewandowski, then that's exactly what Chelsea will do. And obviously with the contract running down, there might be a window there to spend something and get more of a bargain on him. But the main thing to reiterate is that there will be a plan in place for this summer. And the first thing Clearlake Boehly will do is listen to people at the football club, and both in terms of budgets and in terms of targets, try and stick to that plan. And then on top of that, they'll spend some of their money, in my opinion, looking to offer improved terms to Reece James and to Mason Mount and to tie down Christian Pulisic as well. And he'll be important, even though he's not always the most dynamic in terms of the media opportunities he does. And that's an area for development if he wishes to be more of sort of a club ambassador. He's humble. It's not a bad thing. But if you're talking about him being his nickname, Captain America, he doesn't live up to that in terms of the stuff he does away from the football field. And that's, again, not a criticism. It's just a reality. He may not want to develop these aspects of his game, but as he continues to mature and be a poster boy for an American-led consortium, he could become more important. And that aspect of what more can you do with Pulisic in America from a commercial point of view to grow the brand will also be something that the ownership group look at. And when they negotiate with him, they may put more things into his contract on the contingency that he grows and develops and evolves away from the football field and thus becomes more marketable to the football club, the face of a kit launch, goes over to America more, does more media commitments and so on. And these will all be priorities. So I think that it's very difficult, and I never pretend to offer more than I know. So if I don't know an answer, or if an answer hasn't been formulated, I'll say that very openly and honestly, rather than trying to pin a headline to a particular amount of money or a particular signing that is not yet developed or is unrealistic. And that's where I think we're at. I think the honest answer to your question is that Clearlake Boehly plan on listening to people at the football club. They plan on coming through the door. They plan on working out what the managers in the men and women's teams want and need. They plan on assessing the outgoings and then working out what the planned budget was under Abramovich. Then they'll talk to the scouting and recruitment team to work out who's on the radar. And after all of that feedback, they will then work out what is feasible, sustainable, and available. And I think that will be 100, 150 million. But if it proves a bit more or it proves a bit less, that will be based on the feedback of Marina and of the managers, rather than necessarily Clearlake Boehly coming in and saying, we just want to spend a load of money, or we want to make a statement signing. I don't think they'll be there from day one. And one of the reasons why they won't be there from day one is because they don't know at the moment when day one will be. So if the licenses have to be extended and they don't get in immediately, the transfer window opens on June the 10th. They won't be able to act immediately because they may only be 10 days through the door, or they may not yet even be in control of the football club. So I think that every Chelsea fan wants me to say, oh, there'll be 250 million. They're going to try and sign Lewandowski. They're going to keep on to Mount, James, and Pulisic. And some of that may be the plan. But if it's the plan, it's about the legacy plan of the Abramovich part of the club, of which I think Clearlake Boehly will use as a starting point for the next transfer window.
No, it definitely sounds like there's a lot to be positive about. I think from my personal perspective, I think a lot of Chelsea fans share it, is that the approach in the transfer market has got to change because there's not enough thought being given into the signings. It's very much scattergun approach. Oh, so-and-so's doing well in this league, in this team. Let's just buy him and he'll be fine in our team, without actually thinking, does it suit the style of play? Is it the right mentality for the group? Is it, several things that aren't thought about? And there's no surprise that Man City and Liverpool, which I hate to say it as a Chelsea fan, but very few signings flop. Like hardly any in recent years at City or Liverpool. And there's a reason for that, because they recruit properly. And as you touched on, they're looking several windows ahead. Luis Diaz, a prime example, wasn't really meant to come to Liverpool in January. He was probably meant to come in the summer. The interest from Spurs kind of accelerated Liverpool. It looks like he's been there for years. Doesn't look out of place at all. So I think something from my own perspective is that Chelsea need to get smarter in the market, stop looking at big names, go for perhaps slightly more unfancied names, maybe shop a bit more within the Premier League as well, and just be more, more switched on with how they do things. And I think that way is how we can close the gap to the top two and build a sustainable squad for the future. But I mean, we could talk for hours, Ben, but obviously I think that's a good point to round out. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Some fascinating insight there. It's been a real pleasure. If people want to check out more of your work and stuff, obviously, where's the best place for them to go? Just follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is just the digital means through which I'll clarify certain points, but CBS Sports Golasso is the handle for CBS, who I work for as a staffer. And obviously, as a broadcaster, a lot of what I do goes into North American audiences. We've got CBS Sports HQ, which is our equivalent of Sky Sports News, and we've been covering the Chelsea takeover on that. So if people were listening in North America, they'll probably be familiar with that, and I'd certainly encourage you to tune in. We've got cbssports.com, where some of my articles also live. We've got the K Golasso podcast, which is QUEGOLAZO. That's the handle on social media. That's a daily soccer podcast. Chelsea coverage comes up there as well. And that's what's sort of interesting about the whole takeover process that. Some of you have engaged with me via Twitter, and I certainly try and explain what I can and know on that. But the threads aren't your only means of reporting. It's just a way of engaging directly with fans, which hopefully people have appreciated. But when we have an in-depth and we try and gather information and go deeper rather than daily updates or headline grabbing, you'll see them on cbssports.com. And I would shout out as well James Benge, who's another reporter at CBS, who I would encourage you to follow. He was very close to the Broughton bid and provided valuable information. He was a part of the Twitter Spaces that we did via CBS Sports Golasso that hopefully one or two of you tuned into and engaged with. So it's not just me and it's not just CBS either. I know that everyone has their opinion of journalists, but I can tell you, knowing the journalists that have covered the ins and outs of this, whether you like the outlet or the journalist, there's not, in my opinion, an agenda. You've got brilliant local journalists, national journalists, reputable outlets, all trying to give you a perspective. And unfortunately, takeovers are just difficult and complicated. And you're going to get conflicting narratives and sources. And we try and explain that in the best way we can. And I think you're in very good hands through a variety of journalists, whether they're Chelsea specific, UK, or global. And I encourage you to follow all of them to try and get the full picture. And I'm just trying to do my best to offer insight. I don't know all the answers, but I certainly do my best to use my American links or my government links or my Chelsea sources to give you as much context as I can. So follow me if you want on Jacobs Ben Twitter, or block me on Jacobs Ben Twitter. But please do listen to CBS Sports if you're in North America. Follow CBS Sports Golasso. And by the way, bear in mind as a final point that Chelsea's next game is against my team, Leicester. So if you do follow me and like me, if Leicester win, that may be very short-lived and you may be forced to unfollow me over the course of the coming weeks, because my Chelsea narrative could well turn into a Leicester fanboy narrative should Leicester get a victory at Stamford Bridge. But certainly wish Chelsea fans all the best. I must say that most of the Chelsea fans on Twitter, and I've covered a lot of takeovers, have been engaging, intelligent, understanding of the situation, level-headed, and the way that a fan base engages on social media can at times get toxic. Certainly during the Newcastle takeover, there was some very good fans, but there were also at the other extreme some very bad and abusive fans. And I've certainly found with the Chelsea fan base that whether the story is positive or negative, you've all tried to just be hungry for information and debate. And that is a credit to the football club and the fan base.
No, fantastic. Ben, thank you so much, guys. Make sure you check out his work. Really appreciate some fascinating insight. Please do smash a like on this stream and please do subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. But yeah, Ben, thank you so much. Hopefully, Chelsea Takeover will be going through before that May 31st deadline and we can look ahead to the summer. But until then, guys, thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate all the support and catch you again soon.